A man was chained to an iron bar in a cell for more than 10 years. One attendant walked past him twice a day. That was the entire staffing cost of managing him. 2 visits, no conversation, no exercise, no supervision beyond a locked door, and a length of chain 12 inches long. His name was James Norris, though the newspapers called him William. He had been a Marine, committed to Bethlehem Hospital in London in the year 1800. A visitor named Edward Wakefield found him in 1814, riveted into an iron harness that pinned his arms to his sides and locked his neck to the wall. Everyone assumed this was a story about cruelty. It was also a story about a wage bill. One man in chains needs no relief staff, no night shift, no training. A ward of 40 men without restraint needs several. That is the calculation sitting underneath almost everything you are about to hear, and nobody wrote it down in those words, because nobody had to. It was obvious to the people paying the bills. Nobody fed him at a table, walked him in a yard, or gave him anything resembling work. The cell held the bar, the chain, and him. Multiply that arrangement across a whole ward and the saving is not small. It is the difference between paying for one careful attendant and paying for none at all. Here is the strange part, and it runs the opposite way from most hidden economies in history. We are not short on records. Victorian Britain built an entire bureaucracy to count, license, inspect, and price the housing of the insane. Poor law unions kept weekly returns. Commissioners in lunacy filed annual reports. Parliament debated the shilling rate of a pauper lunatic the way it debated the price of bread. For once, we have the ledger, every page of it, and it tells you something the cruelty alone never could, that an asylum was, before it was anything else, a rate per head, per week, and someone, somewhere, was deciding how low that rate could go. Start with what it cost to put a roof over people in the first place. In 1849, Prince Albert laid the foundation stone for a new asylum at Colney Hatch, north of London. The estimate on paper was £150,000. The final bill came in close to double that, and by some contemporary accounts closer to £400,000. At roughly £240 a bed, one commentator called it, without much exaggeration, the most expensive asylum ever built. It opened in July of 1851 with room for around 1,000 patients, a frontage nearly 2,000 feet long, 6 miles of internal corridor, its own farm, its own gasworks, its own brewery. Within 6 years, it needed extending to take 2,000. Now compare that to a smaller job. Between 1846 and 1848, the counties around Denbighshire and North Wales built an asylum for 200 patients. Total cost, just under £64,000. That works out to roughly £320 a bed, which is more per patient than the most expensive asylum in the country. Scale, it turns out, was cheaper per head, not more expensive. 1,000 beds under one roof, one kitchen, one laundry, one water supply, spread the fixed cost thinner than 200 beds ever could. This is why counties kept building bigger, then filling the buildings faster than anyone had planned, then building again. A large asylum also had a second way of clawing back its own construction cost, and it had nothing to do with fees. Colney Hatch was built with a farm of 75 acres attached, along with its own gasworks and its own brewery. Patients worked that farm. Patients worked the kitchens and the laundry too, cooking and cleaning for the institution that housed them. None of this appeared as wages on any ledger, because none of it was paid. It was simply labor the asylum did not have to buy from outside, folded quietly into the same budget line as the bricks and the corridor. Almost every large county asylum built after 1845 copied the model. A self-sufficient asylum was, among other things, a way of getting the weekly maintenance rate down without ever touching the rate itself. But construction was the easy number. The expensive part was every week after the doors opened, for the rest of that person's life. By the 1840s, the going rate for keeping a pauper lunatic in a county asylum averaged around 7 shillings a week. Send the same person to a workhouse instead and reclassify them as an idiot rather than a lunatic, and the parish paid closer to 2 shillings and tenpence, sometimes 3. Send a criminal lunatic to an institution like Bethlehem, and the government itself picked up the tab at 15 shillings a week because that bill came from the Treasury, not the local rate. 3 different words for roughly the same condition, 3 completely different prices, and every relieving officer in the country knew exactly which word to use and who would end up paying for it. This is where the private trade came in. And it came in early. Before 1845, before any parish was required to build its own asylum, most simply contracted the problem out. A private madhouse keeper would take a parish's pauper lunatics off its hands for a fixed weekly sum, and the incentive on both sides pointed the same direction, down. One contractor in Gosport in the 1830s, a man named Mott, took on 240 of the parish poor at 3 shillings and 11 pence a head, undercutting what the parish itself would have spent managing them directly. He was not shy about his method. He believed most paupers were, in his own words, pampered, and he ran his kitchens accordingly. Cut the diet, cut the staff, cut the fuel, and the difference between what the parish paid you and what you actually spent on the patient was yours to keep. Multiply that logic across an entire industry, and you get the empire built by Thomas Warburton. He bought an old asylum called Bethnal House in London in the year 1800, already owned another at Hoxton, and built outward from there. By 1831, his Bethnal Green operation held 933 patients, the overwhelming majority of them paupers sent by their parishes at a fixed weekly rate. When Warburton died that same year, he left his son a decrepit set of buildings, a stack of critical inspection reports, and, by every account, a genuinely sizable fortune. The arithmetic writes itself once you see it. Take in patients at 7 or 8 shillings a week per the parish contract. Spend as little of that as the law and the inspectors will tolerate on food, coal, and wages. The gap is the business. Not every proprietor chose the cheapest path, and the second generation of the Warburton business shows why that mattered too. When Thomas died in 1831, his son John inherited the buildings, the fortune, and the reputation problem that came with both. Rather than keep running the operation at the lowest tolerable standard, John Warburton spent the next 15 years rebuilding it, hiring a well-regarded naval physician to help run the wards, and investing in the fabric of the place itself. By the time the National Commissioners in Lunacy published their special report in 1847, they singled out Bethnal Green as the best institution of its kind in the whole of London. Reputation, it turned out, was also an asset. A license that inspectors trusted was worth more, over years, than the extra shillings saved by cutting corners the inspectors were increasingly willing to publish and prosecute. Both strategies existed inside the same trade in Lunacy at the same time. One betting on volume and minimal spend, the other on quality and survival, and both were entirely rational responses to the same regulatory pressure closing in from Parliament. And the trade had a second, wealthier customer sitting inside the very same walls. Private madhouses did not only take parish paupers. They also took paying patients, families who could afford several pounds a week to have a relative confined somewhere respectable, out of sight of neighbors, and inconvenient for inheritance disputes. Duddeston Hall near Birmingham, opened in 1835 by a surgeon named Thomas Lewis, was licensed for 30 private patients and 60 paupers under one roof. The private patients lived in the old mansion house and walked the gardens. The paupers lived in the converted stables and outbuildings behind it. Same proprietor, same land, same fixed cost of ownership, split across 2 customers who paid wildly different rates and almost certainly never spoke to each other. That is the real trick of the trade in Lunacy. You were not running 2 businesses. You were running 1 building and pricing 2 doors into it differently. Quick one before we go further inside. Pauper ward or private wing? Pick one. I will tell you what it actually cost. In a minute. Reform, when it came, was expensive, and that is worth saying plainly because it usually gets told as a moral story rather than a financial one. After a patient named William Scrivener died, strapped to a bed and left unsupervised overnight at Lincoln Asylum in 1829, the institution began abolishing mechanical restraint altogether. A physician named John Connolly extended the same policy across the whole of Hanwell Asylum in the late 1830s. No chains, no straps, no locked harnesses. It sounds like it should cost nothing. It cost more than almost anything else on the books, because a chain does the work of an attendant, and an attendant earns wages. Take away the chain, and you need more hands watching the same ward around the clock. Proprietors and ratepayers who had spent decades pricing lunacy by the shilling understood this immediately, and non-restraint was argued over in exactly those terms for years. Humane care did not undercut the trade in lunacy. It outspent it, which is precisely why so much of the trade fought it. Parliament eventually stopped leaving the choice to individual parishes. The Lunacy Act of 1845 made it compulsory for every county to build and fund its own asylum out of the local rate, and created a national body of commissioners in lunacy to inspect every institution, public or private, without warning. This did not end the private trade, but it starved its supply of default customers. Why contract out to Warburton's successors at 7 shillings a week when the county now had to build you a bed regardless? The private houses that survived leaned harder into their wealthier voluntary clientele instead. The customers the new county asylums were never built to hold. Even a compulsory public system still ran on a rate, though, and in 1874 the national government started subsidizing it directly, 4 shillings a head, every week, toward the cost of every pauper lunatic sitting in an asylum anywhere in the country. On paper, this was relief for overstretched county rates. In practice, it lowered the marginal cost to the parish of certifying someone and sending them away. The years after 1874 saw asylum populations climb faster than the underlying rate of diagnosed insanity plausibly explains, and it is hard to look at that curve without noticing that somebody, somewhere, had just made committal 4 shillings a week cheaper than it used to be. Nobody needed to intend that outcome for it to happen. Subsidize the behavior, and you tend to get more of it, whether the behavior is emigration, enclosure, or admission to Colney Hatch. Set all of that against the one model built to run at a loss on purpose. In 1796, a Quaker tea merchant named William Tuke opened a small institution outside York called the Retreat, after a member of his own community died in suspicious circumstances inside the York Asylum. It started with about 30 patients and 1 attendant for every 10 of them, a staffing ratio the pauper trade could never have afforded and never once tried to match. There were no chains. Patients worked the grounds, ate at a shared table, and were treated, in Tuke's own phrase, as people whose affections survived even where their reason had not. The Retreat funded this with a sliding scale of fees rather than a flat parish rate. By the early 1900s, its lowest terms for a Quaker patient came to around 12 shillings a week, while a non-Quaker private patient could be charged as much as 7 guineas, more than 13 times as much, for the same building, the same grounds, the same staff. The wealthy patients were, in effect, paying for the poor ones. Nobody called it that at the time. It was simply how a charitable institution kept its 1-to-10 staffing ratio solvent without a county rate standing behind it. So which of these was the business that actually made money, and which one merely survived? The county asylums were never meant to turn a profit. They were a tax-funded utility, built to a budget that reliably doubled and expanded almost as soon as they opened, because nobody could accurately predict how many people the shifting definition of lunacy would eventually catch. The private trade madhouses were the closest thing to a pure commercial enterprise anywhere in this system, and the ones like Warburton's that lasted did so by running 2 customer tiers through a single roof, taking the wide, low margin on parish paupers and the fatter one on private lodgers, while spending as little as an inspector would allow on either. Their real risk was never financial, it was regulatory. A bad report from the commissioners in lunacy could end a license overnight, the way a wrecked hull could end a season's trading, except here, the wreck was a page in a government report rather than a reef. Overcrowding had its own reckoning. And Colney Hatch supplies that one too. By 1903, demand had so far outrun the buildings that around 300 female patients and 40 staff were being housed in temporary huts of corrugated iron and wood, structures that had been thrown up as a stopgap and left standing for 7 years because a permanent replacement was never budgeted. In January of that year, those huts caught fire. 52 women died. No inspector's report, no shilling saved on diet caused that fire directly. But the huts existed at all because expanding a permanent building was expensive and a temporary one was not, and the saving had been sitting there, unresolved, for the better part of a decade. An empty bed costs money to build and heat, whether anyone sleeps in it or not. So nobody built spare capacity, and when the numbers outran the plan, the answer was always the cheapest structure that would pass an inspection that week rather than the one built to last. The retreat proves the counterfactual. Better ratios and better outcomes were entirely possible within this same economy. They simply were not cheap, and cheap was what most of the paying public, meaning the ratepayers, actually wanted. Given a straightforward choice between a shilling saved and a chain removed, the system spent most of the century choosing the shilling, and only moved when reformers made the cost of not choosing it a public embarrassment rather than a private inconvenience. So here is what you were actually buying, if you were a Victorian parish signing a contract for the year. Not treatment, not even really custody. You were buying the disappearance of a problem at the lowest weekly rate the current law and the current inspector would tolerate, and the moment either of those two things moved, so did the price of the disappearance. Raise the shilling rate, and parishes looked harder for a cheaper word to write on the certificate. Tighten the inspection, and proprietors like the younger Warburton discovered that a good reputation kept the contracts coming just as reliably as a low bill once had. Subsidize the rate from London, and the whole country somehow found more people who needed committing. None of it required a villain sitting in a back room deciding to be cruel. It only required a market where the customer, the parish, never had to meet the product, the patient, and where the price was always easier to move than the person. The chains on James Norris were not an aberration from this system. They were the system, worked all the way through to its cheapest possible conclusion. And it took one horrified visitor with a sketchbook to make anyone finally add up what that conclusion had cost.